If I die, I die. Our minds tell us, and history confirms, that the great threat to freedom is the concentration of power. Even though the men who wield this power initially be of good will, and even though they be not corrupted by the power they exercise, the power will both attract and form men of a different stamp. Milton Friedman, Capitalism and Freedom. As the youngest person and first woman ever elected governor of Alaska, Sarah Palin was on top of the world, literally. Speaking to a group in Barrow, Alaska on May 4, 2007, she was 330 miles north of the Arctic Circle and in the northernmost inhabited point in the United States. Spring had arrived at the North Slope. The thermometer would peak that sunny Friday at a balmy 14 degrees above zero. She was in her 5th month in office. Back in Juneau, 1,100 miles away, Bill McAllister, the Capitol reporter for Anchorage's NBC affiliate KTUU, was among several reporters frantically trying to reach the governor or a staff member by phone. In mid-2007, cellular signal coverage had not yet found its way that close to the North Pole. All were hoping to be the first reporter to get the governor's reaction to the huge breaking news story of the day. The problem was that due to the isolation of Barrow, the governor hadn't yet heard about it. Someone eventually acquired the number of a hardline telephone near where the governor was giving her speech and managed to get Palin herself on the line. The reporter dropped the bombshell news. 2 former Republican state legislators, one of them former Speaker of the House Peter Cott, and a current Republican legislator, had all just been arrested in a federal corruption probe. The primary charges against the 3 centered on allegations of soliciting and receiving illegal money and favors from one of the state's largest oil and gas production service companies, the Vico Corporation. A little later on in the day, McAllister begged the governor for a commitment to meet him for an on-camera interview after she got back to the state capitol that evening. It was a lot to ask. The governor had been on the move since before dawn, and the flight back to Juneau was the equivalent of traveling from Dallas to Washington, D.C. in a small aircraft. But it was a massive story, and the governor agreed. McAllister walked up from the press office in the Capitol basement around 9:30 that night and made his way through the corridors. The offices were largely empty and dark. The state legislators and their staffs had long since headed for their favorite Juneau watering holes. They had much to talk about this evening. 3 of their own had been led away in handcuffs earlier in the day, and rumors were swirling that there were more arrests to come. Television stations KTUU's designated spot for shooting stand-up reports and interviews from the Capitol happened to be on the 2nd floor, right outside the speaker's chambers. As McAllister topped the stairs and rounded the corner, he found the familiar hallway cavernous and still. Soon he saw a figure sitting on one of the hallway benches just outside the locked speaker's chamber. It was the governor, with 5-year-old Piper asleep in her arms. No entourage, no handlers, simply there to fulfill a promise. 35 minutes later, Palin did a live interview for the 10 p.m. news in Anchorage, while her daughter slept on the bench a few yards away. The moment impressed McAllister. It was a rare display of integrity and grace by a politician that the hardened reporter would never forget. It was particularly remarkable given the political circumstances then unfolding. Palin's statements that night to McAllister and throughout the unfolding events were consistent and firm. As a fiercely proud Alaskan, the arrests and the ugly national headlines they generated embarrassed her. As a Republican, the systemic corruption they exposed outraged her. But the incident also served to vindicate the entire premise of her successful campaign for the governor's office. She had run, not within the Republican Party power structure in Alaska, but outside of it. Indeed, she'd run in spite of it, even against it. What Palin said was true. For 2 years she had been railing against a set of backroom political manipulators and the deals they had struck with a handful of major oil companies. She was convinced these deals were disastrously bad for the people of Alaska. Understanding why she thought so, and how her crusade against corruption propelled her to the governor's mansion, reveals much about her and much about the political culture in which we live. Owning a piece of land. Nothing is more fundamentally infused in the American ethos or linked to the American dream. Yet in Alaska, the largest piece of undeveloped land in the United States, the federal government owns nearly 60% of the vast acreage. The state controls another 28%, and native peoples have most of the remaining 12%. In reality, less than 1% of Alaska's 658,000 resource-rich square miles is citizen-owned. This has produced a unique set of circumstances there, and a unique mindset to match. The mineral wealth of Alaska is staggering to brought the state to the attention of the world in the 1890s. In the years since, silver, copper, tin, and coal have been found in abundance there too. Above the ground, vast timber forests stretch from horizon to horizon. In the gasoline-thirsty 20th century, however, it was oil that defined Alaska's wealth potential. It had been known for decades that there was abundant oil to be had in Alaska, particularly in the Kenai Peninsula south of Anchorage. The challenge was getting the extracted crude to refineries in the lower 48. Then in 1968, vast repositories of oil were discovered under the permafrost of the North Slope at the very northern edge of the state. Immediately, proposals to build a pipeline connecting the North Slope to sea-based shipping in the south emerged, but they were met with fierce resistance from environmentalists and Alaska Native groups. Lawsuits and legal filings delayed action for years, but amid the OPEC oil embargo and gas shortages of the early 1970s, the nation became eager to see these reserves developed. The result was federal legislation greenlighting one of the most ambitious engineering undertakings since the constructing of the Panama Canal, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, which would carry crude oil from Prudhoe Bay at the top of the state to the Valdez terminals on Prince William Sound, some 800 miles to the south. The pipeline was completed in 1977 with private funds from a consortium of 3 of the major oil companies of the day: British Petroleum, Arco, and Humble Oil. They would recoup their costs and profits from their own oil production on the slope and by charging other oil companies a fee to move their oil through the pipeline. It sounded like a feasible arrangement, but in practice those fees ended up discouraging other oil companies from developing their North Slope holdings because they took too big a bite out of the profit margins, especially when oil prices were low. Decades later, many knowledgeable Alaskans would warn state leaders against repeating the same mistake when a new pipeline proposal was dominating political discussions in the state. Nevertheless, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline transformed Alaska economically. Taxes on oil profits and shipping, as well as royalties from oil production on state lands, flooded state coffers, allowing the state to slash the tax burden on individual citizens. Before the pipeline, Alaska's state income tax was 14.5%, the highest in the nation. The inescapable logic of mathematics drove the high tax rate. Alaska had a tiny population, spread across staggering distances, in a brand new state that had little infrastructure in place. It had challenges no other state had ever faced, expensive challenges. Completion of the pipeline allowed Alaska to eliminate the state income tax completely. Around the same time, the state established something called the Alaska Permanent Fund. The fund was written into the very constitution of the state by amendment and called for 25% of certain oil and gas-related revenues to be set aside in a sort of endowment for the people of Alaska. The driving philosophy behind the Permanent Fund was a simple one. It recognized that though individual Alaskans had only a tiny sliver of the state available for private ownership, and even less where mineral rights are available, the state's natural resource wealth belonged to all Alaskans collectively, and it was therefore a moral imperative that all Alaskans benefit from the development of those resources. The fund grew rapidly through deposits from the state, and it grew further still through prudent investment of the capital. As a result, each year every citizen of Alaska receives a dividend check from the fund. The size of the check varies and is calculated according to using a set formula, one based upon the fund's average income in the previous 5 years. In 2009, that dividend check was $1,305 to every man, woman, and child who had lived in the state the entirety of the previous year. The payout totaled $875 million. The year before it was $2,069. What is more, Governor Palin gained approval for her Alaska's Clear and Equitable Share, ACES, measured in 2007. This resource debate added an additional $1,200 per citizen to the dividend. Thus, a family of 5 in 2008 received checks totaling $16,345. Understandably, the Permanent Fund has become a significant source of income for Alaska citizens, and therefore a key driver of the state economy. The same is true for the government as a whole. The revised 2010 budget forecast for Alaska anticipates that oil taxes, royalties, and fees will provide 82% of the state's anticipated $3.18 billion in unrestricted revenues. Add to all that the jobs the industry generates directly and indirectly, and one begins to understand how intricately enmeshed the oil and gas industry has become in the life of every Alaskan. Naturally, the overwhelming majority of Alaskans value the presence of the oil industry in their state. Though most are staunch conservationists, they have seen with their own eyes that development of natural resources and preservation of nature are not mutually exclusive. 3 decades later, almost none of the doomsday predictions from opponents of the pipeline have materialized, even after a 2002 earthquake that registered 7.9 on the Richter scale. Though not directly related to the pipeline, the 1989 wreck of the Exxon Valdez oil tanker in Prince William Sound did deal a temporary blow to the state's confidence. Still, Alaska is much more like Texas than California in citizen attitudes towards the oil industry. In the Golden State, most citizens oppose development of the state's oil deposits. In Alaska, the vast majority of citizens want the oil and gas industry working in the state, and they would like to see more exploration and drilling, not less. It is revealing that in a survey conducted 10 years after the Exxon Valdez tanker spill, 95% of Alaskans rated their opinion of oil and gas development in Alaska as good or very good. Nevertheless, by the turn of the millennium, a confluence of events threatened Alaska's oil-driven prosperity. Environmentalists and their allies in Congress had continued their success in keeping a small section of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, ANWR, and that section's 5 to 15 billion barrels of recoverable oil locked up from exploration. Meanwhile, production was steadily declining on the North Slope for a number of economic reasons, just one of which was the fact that oil was falling out of favor as an energy source due to global concerns about climate change. It became clear to Alaska's leaders that, should these trends continue, all Alaskans would be feeling the negative impact in a few years. There was one major good news, bad news element in all of this. The good news was that the North Slope was holding more than oil. It also happens to be one of the largest repositories of natural gas on the planet, and cleaner burning gas is much less fraught with controversy as an energy source than the derivatives of crude oil. The bad news was that would-be producers were faced with the same huge challenge they faced with North Slope oil in the early 70s, getting it to market. Efforts to get a natural gas pipeline built go all the way back to the Carter administration. Various proposals have generally fallen into one of 2 basic strategies for getting natural gas to the lower 48. Some have called for building a parallel pipeline that follows the existing route of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline to Valdez. There, the gas would be converted to a denser liquid form, LNG, and loaded on ships for transport. Another breed of past proposals has called for building a line that runs southeast to Canada to connect with new or existing pipeline networks there. What is clear is that since the completion of the Trans-Alaskan Pipeline back in 1977, getting a companion natural gas conduit planned, approved, financed, and built has been the elusive holy grail of every successive Alaskan governor. It is an unspeakably complex goal. Success meant negotiating a labyrinth of existing federal regulations and prohibitions, overcoming court challenges from various opposition groups, and balancing the needs of key interests. There were 2 parties occupying the opposite ends of that balancing act. On the one side, there were the 3 oil companies with the largest holdings on the North Slope, known as the Big Three, for it was most likely one or a combination of these that would finance, engineer, and profit from the pipeline. On the other side were the people of Alaska. In 2002, Alaskans thought they finally had the person who could get it done. The 22-year veteran of the U.S. Senate, Frank Murkowski, had come home to run for governor. Toward the end of 2001, Palin's second term as Wasilla's mayor entered its final year. The local term limits law meant Sarah was facing a decision about life beyond the mayor's office. She knew she could return to being a full-time mom. This had its appeal, particularly with Piper's addition to the family earlier that year. But Palin took seriously that sense of calling to the realm of public policy and government she had felt those years ago. She began to ponder what her next step might be, how God might cause her path to unfold. She briefly pondered a run for a seat in the state legislature, but quickly rejected that option. Palin knew herself well enough to realize that she was ill-suited to the deal-making, horse-trading, and compromise required to be an effective legislator. She saw things in black and white terms and knew that lawmaking is done in a sea of gray. She was wired to be an executive, and she knew it. It was already public knowledge that Alaska's longtime junior U.S. Senator, Frank Murkowski, was planning to return from Washington to run for governor. That meant the Republicans would already be geared up to mount a strong statewide effort in the general election. For 5 years, Sarah had been the chief executive of the fastest growing city in Alaska. The majority opinion was that she had performed wonderfully. One of the paradoxes of Alaska is that its big places are small and its little places enormous. Wasilla is a small town by almost anyone's standards, yet it is Alaska's fourth largest municipality, prominent and conspicuous.